Hello, everyone. My name is Adriana Jagger-Rickles, and today I will be presenting to you this talk entitled Discovering the Link Between Trauma Psychopathology, Cognitive Dysfunction, and the Brain through a Novel Unsupervised Learning Approach. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar, PTSD is a rather heterogeneous disorder. And what I mean by that in a clinical sense is that there are thousands of combinations of PTSD symptoms that can give rise to the diagnosis of PTSD. And I also mean this neurologically in the fact that many brain regions, brain systems, and brain circuits have been implicated in PTSD. So what are some ways we could combat this? Well, one way that we could try and investigate this further is by looking at how clinical and brain relationship, what those relationships are. And in doing so, we might be able to explain something more than we would potentially get from just looking at, say, clinical independently or the brain independently. Now, there have been some ways that we could investigate these brain symptom relationships. And one of these ways that we've looked at this has been, potentially looking at how other aspects of psychology, such as cognition, might relate to brain symptom relationships. We can also look for transdiagnostic patterns. So are there aspects of brain symptom relationships that go across just PTSD and go into other comorbidities? And what this might tell us is that there are shared aspects of brain symptom relationships. And while that might not tell us something unique about PTSD, it will tell us, what might be specific, might be more general to pathology, and therefore whatever's left over might be more specific to the disorder of PTSD. Now, another way, and the way that I will be showing you today, is using machine learning or data-driven based approaches, which can look for latent patterns or more complex patterns of brain symptom relationships. And one way to look at brain symptom relationships from a machine learning based approach would be using canonical correlation analysis. Now, canonical correlation analysis, let me set up what this is. So say we have a set of brain connectivity, so a data set of just brain connections, and say we have a data set of clinical symptoms. And if we were to take then the weighted sum of both brain connectivity and clinical symptoms, we would get a value for the brain and a value for clinical symptoms, and we would do this for each subject. And then we would take the correlation of the brain values we just made and the clinical values we just made, and when we correlated them together, that would be our canonical correlation. Now again, this is a very general description of what a CCA is. But more formally, what CCA does is it finds the maximum correlation between the linear combination of two high-dimensional data sets. And this, you could potentially find multiple dimensions of relationships between these two data sets. And I'll also mention that for people who might be familiar with PCA, it's similar in the regards that it's a data decomposition approach. And so it decomposes both data sets simultaneously to find the maximum correlation between these decompositions. And this is different from PCA in the fact that PCA would have to decompose both of these data sets independently, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're correlated. So again, CCA is looking for those relationships between these data sets. So CCA has been used previously in the literature. For example, Andrew Drysdale was interested in brain symptom relationships in depression. And so using resting state connectivity and depression symptoms, they found two canonical correlations. The first was an anhedonia prefrontal canonical variant. And here they found primarily anhedonia-based symptoms were correlated with prefrontal connectivity. And then they found a second canonical variant that found anxiety-based symptoms that were correlated with subcortical brain connections. So again, found brain symptom relationships here. Now, canonical correlation is great, but there have been recent improvements in canonical correlation. So for instance, let's think if we have thousands of brain connections that we are putting into this canonical correlation. Not all of them might contribute or account for much variance in our canonical correlation. They might be redundant. So it might be useful to remove them or to do something with them in order to potentially improve our canonical correlation and maybe not overfit our data. So there has been a version of canonical correlation that is sparse, so sparse canonical correlation helps us with this issue. And so what sparse canonical correlation does is, again, we'll have our brain and clinical symptoms here, and then it would remove or sparse out the variables that are not contributing to the overall canonical correlation. And then again, we would go through our canonical correlation just as I had described previously. So what did we want to use canonical correlation for? In this study, what we wanted to do is look at relationships, like is there a general relationship in between brain connectivity and PTSD symptoms? And if there is, are there multiple dimensions of these brain symptom relationships? And then do these brain symptom or brain clinical relationships, do they interact with cognition, or do they have transdiagnostic properties? To do this, we looked at 352 trauma-exposed veterans that were mostly men, young to middle age, and mostly high school educated. Then we have to, of course, come up with our clinical and brain variables. And so for my clinical variables, I use the clinically administered PTSD scale, or CAPS, and I have 17 symptoms that arise from there. And then I have brain, I'm using resting state connectivity, parcellated into 17 networks. And then I'm running my sparse canonical correlation in R, using the PMA toolbox, and also scripts provided by Xie et al. In 2018. And if you wanted to look at how brain connectivity is related to general pathology, Xie et al.'s paper does this beautifully using sparse CCA. So if you're interested, check it out. All right, so our first canonical variant we found was this DMN posterior medial with general PTSD canonical variant. And here you'll see this bar graph is showing you the importance or weights of each of the symptoms here, and how much, and that importance or weight is basically how much each of these are contributing to the CCA. And I have this organized by 4 symptom clusters of the CAPS, so re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance, numbing, and hyperarousal based symptoms. And then the CCA also found 37 brain connections. And if I'll direct you to this graph down here, you'll see that the importance degree, so this is basically telling us how many connections within each network were selected in this CCA. And from this, you'll see that we had one network that seemed to be have the highest degree of relationship of this canonical correlation, and this was this DMN posterior medial network. All right, so our second canonical variant was a control limbic avoidance based canonical variant. And so for this CCA or canonical variant, we found 2 symptom clusters that were kind of that were selected here. 2 from the re-experiencing, so 2 out of 5, but it selected all of the avoidance-based symptoms. And then this variant also selected 34 brain connections, primarily in 3 networks. So again, this DMN posterior medial, this limbic orbital frontal, and a control frontal parietal network, for a total of 3 networks. And then we have our third canonical variant that we found, which was a subcortical limbic numbing canonical variant. And this canonical variant selected primarily or exclusively numbing symptoms, and 31 brain connections, primarily from 2 networks. Again, this DMN posterior medial network, and the subcortical limbic, which includes the amygdala and hippocampus, for a total of 2 networks. All right, so now that we have our 3 canonical variants that we found, we also have, we also wanted to look at how brain variants might relate to clinical based aspects of PTSD, comorbidities of PTSD, and cognitive impairment. And the reason why we wanted to look at the brain is that the brain variant, and the fact that, you know, this brain variant is a summed score of those connections that I just showed you. And we want to see how it might selectively be related to PTSD symptoms. We also want to see if it can tell us something about comorbidities of PTSD or cognition. So to do this, we're looking at the relationship of, again, clinical, we're using CAPS symptom clusters, so an average of the re-experiencing, avoidance, numbing, and hyperarousal. And then for comorbidities, we're looking at depression and anxiety scales from the DAS. And for cognitive impairment, we're looking at the domains of attention, memory, and executive function. So first up are the clinical variables. All right, to orient you to these axes here, on the y-axis, we have the correlation with the brain variate, and I have the brain variates clustered here so that this grouping of variables is related to this DMN brain variate, then to the control limbic variate and subcortical limbic. And here I have in color the variable that it's correlated with, so re-experiencing avoidance, numbing, and hyperarousal. And you'll see that all 4 of these aspects of PTSD are correlated with all 3 of the brain variates. Now moving on to depression and anxiety. Depression is in orange here, anxiety in yellow. And you'll see again that all 3 of the canonical variates are correlated with anxiety and depression. So all 3 seem to have transdiagnostic properties. And lastly, we'll look at cognitive impairment. So attention is in dark green, memory is in light green, executive in lime green. And you'll see that the first 2 canonical variates are highly correlated with attention impairment, whereas the third canonical variate is strongly correlated with memory impairment. All right, so let's put this all together. Our first canonical variate that I showed you was this DMN with posterior medial portion with general PTSD. And this brain variant was correlated with a wide aspect of PTSD symptoms, transdiagnostic properties, and with attention impairment. Our second canonical variant was selected control limbic networks, and also primarily avoidance-based symptoms from the CAPS. And this brain variant was correlated again with PTSD symptoms, with transdiagnostic properties of anxiety and depression, and with attention impairment, quite similar to the first canonical variant. And lastly, we have a subcortical limbic numbing variant, which primarily selected numbing symptoms and subcortical limbic networks, primarily the amygdala and hippocampus. And this also was correlated with depression, with PTSD symptoms, with depression and anxiety, and also with memory impairment, which was the most unique effect here. So what does this tell us about PTSD? Well, what I think is interesting here, when I went through, is that the DMN posterior medial subnetwork was found in all 3 of these canonical variants, which could either indicate that this is a general factor of PTSD, or that this network is implicated in many aspects of pathology. And I think it could potentially be the latter, in the fact that the brain variant, which again included this network in all 3, was correlated with attention and, with anxiety and depression pretty strongly. So again, this might be like an overall PTSD or pathology relationship here. But on top of that, we see some specificity here. So the second canonical variant showed primarily these avoidance-based symptoms is what it's selected for. But these avoidance-based symptoms might be important for these systems in the brain of control limbic prefrontal systems. And further, we see that it also when we look at the brain variant, it also was correlated most strongly with avoidance-based symptoms, so really showing how important these avoidance-based symptoms are, but also it, again, is strongly correlated with attention impairment. So there's some unique pattern here. Similarly, with the subcortical limbic numbing variant, again, it selected these numbing-based symptoms with primarily these subcortical networks, primarily the amygdala and hippocampus. So again, some unique effect here, and it shows a different profile from the first 2 canonical variants and how the brain variant correlates with other aspects of behavior, including having this unique effect with the memory impairment being related to with the hippocampus and amygdala. So again, showing some specificity as well as some generalizability. All right, so I covered the first 2 aspects already as I was going through the previous slides, so I'll leave that up here for you guys. But I want to go through what our next steps are. So what we want to do next is we want to replicate this in an independent sample because we want to know the generalizability of these variants. Also, what we want to do is we want to see if these variants predict diagnoses, treatment responses, or longitudinal changes. And lastly, we are interested and want to look at and plan to are using cluster-based analyses to determine of these dimensions of PTSD that we're finding of brain symptom relationships. Are there clusters of people that we might be able to find subtypes with? So that's where we want to go moving forward. And with that, I would like to thank a lot of people. I would love to thank everyone in Ball Lab, especially my postdoctoral mentor, Dr. Mike Esterman and Dr. Joe DeGudis, but also all the postdocs in Ball Lab and all the RAs in Ball Lab. I couldn't do this work without them. And of course, all of our funding. And I would like to also share with you my email and my Twitter handle in case you want to reach out or have questions. And again, thank you for listening.